Welcome to the final Biology Paper 2 video. This one's going to focus on ecology. So to start us off, I'm just going to go through some of the key words for this unit, because there's absolutely loads of them. And we're basically just thinking about ecological relationships. So the first key word is ecosystems, so that is referring to all of the organisms living in a habitat and the non-living aspects of the habitat too. A population is a group of individuals of the same species. A community is many populations living together. Competition is to do with the fact that animals compete for factors such as food, mates and territory. Plants compete for factors such as light, space, water and minerals from the soil. Interdependence is when a species or species rely on each other for food, shelter, pollination, seed dispersal and many other things. A stable community is when all the species and the environmental factors are in balance, so that population sizes remain fairly constant. And what that means is within a stable community, typically, the numbers of predators and prey is going to rise and fall in cycles. Adaptations are features that enable organisms to survive in the conditions that they normally live in, and it can be structural things, behavioural things, or functional things. And the last key word for this section is extremophiles. Those are organisms that are adapted to live in very extreme conditions, such as really high temperatures, high pressures, and kind of salt concentrations as well. So that tends to be things like bacteria that live in really deep sea vents, and those kinds of organisms. Okay. The next thing we need to kind of be aware of is biotic and abiotic factors. Now, as a general kind of difference, the biotic factors are living factors, abiotic are non-living. Biotic factors include things such as food availability, new predators, new pathogens or diseases, or one species outcompeting another. Abiotic, the non-living factors, are things such as light intensity, temperature, moisture levels, soil pH and mineral content, wind intensity and direction, carbon dioxide levels for plants, and oxygen levels for aquatic animals like fish and things like that. Thinking then about the organisation of ecosystems, they can be kind of displayed by food chains and food webs, and we need to kind of understand the different levels of a food chain or a food web. So they all start with a producer, which is typically a green plant, and producers need to be able to photosynthesize to produce glucose, which obviously then we know is used as the source of energy when it's respired during respiration to release energy. So they all begin with a producer. Without producers, nothing else in the food chain would exist. Producers are eaten by primary consumers. Primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers, secondary by tertiary, and then eventually at some point, and it could be lower down the food chain than this, it's not necessarily fourth or fifth, we reach an apex predator, which is the organism that's at the top of the food chain that has no known predators. So one key thing to kind of bear in mind with the food chains is that the direction of the arrows must always kind of go up the food chain, because the arrow is showing the direction of energy transfer between the different levels. We also need to know what prey are and what predators are. Now obviously prey are either, they're the animals or organisms eaten by the predators, and the predators are the things that eat the prey. And then obviously we've got our different levels as we've already discussed. Required practical for this unit is the one where you do ecological sampling using a quadrat, which is the square kind of metal frame, and a transect, which is a long tape, basically like a long tape measure. Typically, when you do this practical, you would set your transect line up, and then you would use your quadrat to sample at regular intervals along the transect line, or you could use a quadrat to sample randomly if you're sampling kind of a whole area, looking at maybe one variable. With regard to independent and dependent variables, it will depend really on what type of investigation you're doing here. The independent variable is the thing you change, so typically that could be, the area that you're sampling with the quadrat, because you're going to move your quadrat around to different areas, or it could be the factor being investigated, which is what we did in class. For instance, we looked at how light intensity, so whether it's sunny or shady, affects the growth of daisies. Dependent variables are going to be the number of organisms, and typically if it's a quadrat you're counting plants, that are present within that area that you're sampling. Okay, and now what you can tend to be asked to do with quadrats and sampling is you would put a quadrat down in certain areas around kind of, let's say, a field. You would do a certain, like a decent number of samples from that quadrat, count up and do your mean or your average number of organisms, plants within that frame. And then you could then suggest for the whole size of the field in its entirety how many organisms you predict to be present. So say we sampled the school field and we found on average there's 20 daisies per quadrat. You could work out the area of the quadrat, work out the area of the whole field, and then multiply it up to work out, how many daisies you would expect there to be on average in the field as a whole. Then we need to look at materials and how they're cycled within an ecosystem. So the two cycles we need to know for this unit are the carbon cycle and the water cycle. With the carbon cycle, it returns carbon from organisms to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide to then be used by plants in photosynthesis. With the water cycle, the main purpose of it is to provide fresh water for plants and animals on land before draining into the seas. Water is continuously evaporated and precipitated, and that's kind of what keeps the cycle flowing, really. Okay, last little section then, looking at biodiversity. What biodiversity is it's the variety of different species, of all the different species, on Earth or within an ecosystem. And by ensuring that there's a rich biodiversity, it actually helps to stabilise ecosystems. So biodiversity is something that we want to maintain. We do not want to kind of reduce biodiversity, but unfortunately, currently, there are lots of things that humans particularly are doing that are destroying biodiversity across the world. So the kinds of things that destroy it, just a few examples here, are things such as poor waste management. So obviously humans produce waste through lots of different activities, and that waste management, whether it's put in landfill, whether it's being burnt, or being processed or whatever, can increase pollution in the water, in the air, and on land. So big problems with that. Land use, such as overusing different bits of land, destroying habitats to do building, quarrying, farming, and also kind of create waste disposal sites, massively reduces areas which would normally can be very rich in biodiversity in terms of plants and animals. Destruction of peat bogs. So peat bogs are what we tend to kind of get compost from, and by reducing the area of the habitat, so actually by destroying them, by burning or actually letting them decay, it reduces the area of the habitat, destroys lots of plants, animals, and also microorganisms. But also, in the process of destroying the peat bogs, it actually releases carbon dioxide as well, which furthers kind of the impact of global warming. Deforestation, so cutting down large areas of forest, rainforest for cattle farming, rice fields, biofuel farming, or growing, and also just growing of kind of crops in general, massively reduces biodiversity. And then another kind of big impact which relates to a lot of things in terms of burning peat bogs, burning the trees and things that are cut down from forests, or just generally kind of poor pollution management and things like that as well, all contribute to global warming due to increased methane and carbon dioxide that's released into the atmosphere. Global warming has many, many biological consequences on land and in the oceans in terms of all living things. So it has huge impacts because obviously the temperature's changing, that affects ecosystems enormously. Last little bit, how can we stop this then? What can we do to actually try to conserve biodiversity and kind of reduce some of the effects of all of these things we just mentioned? A few different things that we're doing at the minute mainly. Breeding programs for endangered species, so that's a big one to try and kind of stop species going extinct. Protection and regeneration of habitats, so where we've kind of chopped down loads of forests and trees, actually planting new trees and things like that. Reintroduction of field margins and hedgerows, so where they've been destroyed for farming, actually planting them again because they're kind of a really important aspect of ecosystems. Reduction of deforestation, so actually putting laws in place to stop people destroying the forests, and also putting limits, and this is done by governments and kind of global initiatives, putting limits on carbon dioxide emissions. And the final one is recycling, instead of obviously just throwing things into landfill or into the sea. So just a few, and there's loads more than that, but just a few examples of the key ways we are conserving biodiversity.